Now we'll move on to the colonies and how they grow angry against the mother country, England. So here we are on our timeline, and it's important to know that the tensions between Great Britain and its American colonies started to grow as British leaders sought greater control over the North American empire. So at the end of this lecture, I hope that you're able to summarize the events that fueled this colonial discontent and explain how the Stamp Act affected the relationship between Britain and the colonies. We'll start off with the French and Indian War. The conflict between the French and English over dominance in Europe in the late 1600s and 1700s finally spilled over into America. In 1740, a common interest in the Ohio River Valley led to tensions between the French and the British. Both sides began building forts to claim the territory. This is the Ohio River Valley right here. George Washington, who was 22 at the time, was asked to intervene for the British and expel the French. American troops started toward the Ohio River in the spring of 1754. After a brief battle, Washington and his troops retreated. He returned to the colonies, a hero for attempting to resist the French. The British government suggested that the American colonies form an alliance with the Iroquois, Native Americans, and during a meeting called the Albany Conference between the colonists and the Iroquois agreed to remain neutral, and the colonists agreed that Britain should name one of its supreme commanders of all British troops in the colonies. The conference issued what was known as the Albany Plan of Union, the first suggestion that the colonies were going to unite to form a federal government. The British Commander-in-Chief, General Edward Braddock, appointed George Washington to serve as his aide. In 1755, French and Native American forces ambushed the British troops near Fort Duquesne in western Pennsylvania. Washington's leadership saved the British from disaster. For the next 2 years, the French and Indian War was fought on the frontier. In 1756, fighting between Britain and France spread to Europe and became known as the 7 Years' War. Britain's allies fought the French in Europe. Britain's prime minister sent most of Britain's forces to North America and India to fight the French. The turning point of the war occurred with a British victory at Quebec. The Treaty of Paris finally ended the war in 1763 and for the most part eliminated French power in North America. The British victory caused an enormous British debt. Britain looked to its colonies to help pay for the war. In the spring of 1763, Pontiac, who was chief of the Ottawa people, united several Native American groups, including the Ottawa, Delaware, Shawnee, and Seneca peoples, to go to war against the British. They attacked forts and towns along the frontier. The British government did not want to pay for another war, so it issued what is known as the Royal Proclamation of 1763. This limited Western settlement. Colonists were not allowed to settle in certain areas without the government's permission. So colonists could not pass this line right here. The proclamation angered many farmers and land speculators who wanted to move west to make a living and make more money by selling land. In an effort to reduce British debt and pay for the British troops in North America, George Grenville, the British Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury, implemented new tax policies in the colonies. Merchants smuggled goods in and out of America to avoid customs duties or taxes paid on imports and exports. Grenville convinced Parliament to pass a law that sent smugglers to a new Vice Admiralty Court in Nova Scotia run by naval officers who were unsympathetic to smugglers. Grenville also introduced the Sugar Act in the colonies. This act changed tax rates for raw sugar and molasses imported from foreign colonies. It placed new taxes on silk, wine, coffee, pimento, and indigo. Merchants felt the Sugar Act would hurt trade and argued that it violated traditional English rights. Colonists argued that they were being taxed without representation in Parliament. To slow inflation, which inflation is a general rise in the prices of most goods and services because money has lost its value, Parliament passes the Currency Act of 1764. This banned the use of paper money in the colonies, angering colonial farmers and artisans who used paper money to pay back loans. To raise more money to pay for the war, Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765. Stamps were required on most printed materials. The stamp tax was the first direct tax Britain had ever placed on the colonists. The Quartering Act, passed by Parliament in 1765, forced the colonists to pay more for their own defense by providing places for British troops to stay in the colonies. By the summer of 1765, mass meetings and demonstrations against the Stamp Act took place in the colonies. When the Stamp Act took effect, the colonists ignored it. A movement began to boycott British goods. Colonial merchants signed a non-importation agreement, agreeing not to buy any British goods until the Stamp Act was repealed. The protest led to the Stamp Act being repealed in 1766. Parliament, in an effort to assert its control over the colonies, passed the Declaratory Act, which gave them the power to make laws for the colonies. In 1767, British Finance Minister Charles Townshend introduced a new set of regulations and taxes known as the Townshend Acts. One of these acts, the Revenue Act of 1767, placed new customs duties on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea imported into the colonies. The Revenue Act legalized the use of general search warrants called writs of assistance. The Townshend Acts gave British officials the right to seize property without following due process. John Dickinson published a series of essays called Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer, which stressed that only assemblies elected by colonists had the right to tax them. Dickinson called on colonists to resist the Townshend Acts. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed the Virginia Resolve, stating that only the House had the right to tax Virginians. Britain ordered that the House of Burgesses be dissolved. Leaders of the House of Burgesses called a convention and passed a non-importation law blocking the sale of British goods in Virginia. The Daughters of Liberty encouraged colonists to support the boycott of British goods. In 1769, colonial imports from Britain declined sharply from what they had been the year before. On March 5, 1770, Captain Thomas Preston sent British troops to protect the customs house in Boston from a group of colonists who had gathered nearby. 20 minutes later, the troops had killed or wounded 11 people. The tragedy became known as the Boston Massacre. A man, Crispus Attucks, of African and Native American descent, was the first colonist to die. The British were viewed as tyrants who were killing people for standing up for their rights. In response, Britain repealed the Townshend Acts, leaving only one tax on tea to uphold its right to tax the colonies.